morning and welcome to our forum today. My name is Wayne Jennings and I'm the host for today's discussion titled, The 2020 Presidential Election, What Happened? Given this subject, we hope to challenge you with new information about an election that could break America. President Donald Trump could easily throw the election results into chaos. Who will stop him? As Unitarian Universalists, we organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all who attend. I'd now like to introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Ken Fries. He's a member of our forum committee, and he will introduce the topic and the speaker. Ken, take it away.
Thanks, Dwayne. First of all, I'd like to note the League of Women Voters is co-sponsoring this forum topic. We appreciate the League for its election expertise, commitment, and service to the voters in Cuyahoga County. We especially want to recognize their advocacy on many important issues that will be discussed today in this forum. So with that, I welcome everyone who is attending. We choose today's topic for discussion. Ohio has over 8 million registered voters for presidential election. 5.8 million actually voted. So what was the role of the virus, COVID-19, grassroots activism, protests, gerrymandering, online negative messaging, economic uncertainty, and super PACs play? How did this affect the election? Now, and how have political parties, how have they changed? Have women and minorities made a difference in this election turnout? Or is it just another attention-getting issue for the media? So for this morning's speaker, we have Professor Tom Sutton. He is the chair of Political Science Department at Baldwin Wallace. He directs their Community Research Institute. He also serves as an independent political analyst for Channel 5 News and provides periodic analysis of local and national political news and develops this for them. With this, Dr. Sutton, we welcome your comments.
Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. Today, we're going to talk about at least some of these many topics related to the 2020 presidential election. We could have a session that might go on most of the day if we tried to dig into every detail. So I'm going to really just focus on some highlights, give you some numbers to look at. One particular, both in terms of the turnout, the use of the mailed ballot, and also how much money was spent. $14 billion on this cycle. We broke every record possible. The good news is that we also broke records when it came to voter turnout. And I think that's always a plus, regardless of your political affiliation. So I'm going to start just with a brief overview of the national and Ohio results. We saw eligible voter turnout. Now, this is people who are eligible to vote, not just those that are registered. So it is a lower percentage than you might see in some other sources, which tend to also tend to focus on registered voters. But for the United States, we saw a 64.5% turnout, which may rise to about 66.7% once we have all of the outstanding ballots counted, the provisionals, the overseas, and the mail ballots that are still being counted, including here in Ohio. That is a huge increase, up to 6 points more than what we saw in 2016. And for historical reference, the all-time turnout of eligible voters was in 1908 at 65.7%. So at least in modern times. I don't know if we really have accurate records going back to the early 1800s when Andrew Jackson was running. For the Electoral College, we are at this point largely confirmed, except for the recount happening in Georgia, that Joe Biden won with 306 Electoral College votes versus Trump with 232 Electoral College votes, which is an exact reversal of the 2016 outcome in which Trump got 306 and Hillary Clinton got 232. States that switched from Trump to Biden that caused this turnaround from 4 years ago: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And for the first time since 1960, Ohio was not part of the states that voted for the winning candidate in this election. For totals, the vote totals for Biden were 50.9%, Trump 47.4%. Biden has a margin at this point of 5.4 million votes, which is considerably higher than the 2 to 3 million vote margin that we saw 4 years ago that Hillary Clinton had, despite the Electoral College turnout. For Ohio, eligible voter turnout, 65.1%. We think that's going to go up, possibly up to another 5 points. We have about 280,000 outstanding votes still being counted. And I believe that those will be all released, a final result sometime in the next week. It will not make a difference in the outcome, given the sizable margin that President Trump won Ohio by. Compared to 2016, it was 62.9% turnout. So you see we have likely about a 7-point difference improvement in Ohio. The preliminary election result, Trump 53.4%, Biden 45.2%, mirroring the 8-point advantage that Trump won by 4 years ago. But again, once you add in those 280,000 some votes that have yet to be added to the totals, many of which are coming from urban areas like Cuyahoga County, I expect that margin to narrow at least by 2 percentage points, possibly more. So the three largest counties, if we look at the three counties, Cuyahoga, Franklin, and that's a mistake, that should say Hamilton, not Summit, my apologies. Biden won those three biggest counties in Ohio by 460,742 votes. The remaining 85 counties in Ohio, however, Trump won by 931,479 votes. And so you see the difference, 470 votes, 737 votes, larger than his difference in 2016, which is 446,841. Basically, the story in Ohio is that there was a higher turnout for Biden, but there was a much higher turnout for Trump, particularly in the rural counties. And you see 36 counties in Ohio Trump had at least a 70 to 79% win. 8 counties, 80 to 84%. 84% Holmes County holds the record for the highest percentage of votes that Trump earned in Ohio. So then if we look at exit polling data from 2020 and 2016, you'll see that this is really looking at some of these issues related to demographics, that white males voted for Biden in 2020, 38%, 61% for Trump in 2020. Biden did better compared to Clinton, who had 32% of the white male vote. Trump also lost a point there, and that was about 33% of the sample. This is Edison Research exit polling that was done that day, as well as polling early voters. They polled early voters by phone and by email in the week or so before the election. White females, Biden 44%, Trump 55%. If you go over here to Clinton, about the same, 45% for Clinton, 47% for Trump. So this is a difference. You see an 8-point loss by Trump of white females in 2020 compared to 2016. And that's a huge impact on the national results. For black males, 79% for Biden in 2020, 19% for Trump. Compared to Clinton, about the same. She got a little more, 81% versus 14% for Trump. Black females, 90% for Biden, 9% for Trump. But basically, Biden did not do as well, because 98% of black females voted for Clinton in 2016. Then we will go to the Latino vote. Latino males, 59% for Biden, 36% for Trump. Comparing that to Clinton, Clinton did better. She got 65% of that same vote. But of course, Trump did better in 2020, 36% versus 28%. And then for Latino females, 69% for Biden, 67% for Clinton, a little bit of an increase. 30% for Trump, 28% for Trump in 2016. So roughly about the same we see there. Among all other ethnicities, genders, we saw 58% for Biden, 38% for Trump. We do not have those numbers for Clinton-Trump 2016. So that gives you, based on gender and race/ethnicity, a breakdown that basically shows some changes in favor of Biden versus Clinton 4 years ago among white females. But Trump did better among Black males, among Latino males, and slightly better among Latino females. And then basically held his own when it came to white males. So this is another comparison looking at Ohio by largest, the 7 counties that Biden won. And the map that you see on the left is a map that I found on Vox.com that basically showed the difference from 2016 to 2020 in who had greater gains based on those 2 elections. So in both of these states where you see blue, that means that Biden had greater gains than Trump. Biden compared to Clinton had greater gains than Trump 2016 to 2020. The red basically show you where Trump had greater gains in those counties compared to his performance in 2016. Greater gains than Biden this year and than he had against Clinton 4 years ago. So looking at that map, even though Biden only won 7 counties in Ohio, this shows that he actually did better than Trump comparatively in several of these counties. Now, obviously, it didn't make much of a difference in Ohio. Trump's margin was wider than it was 4 years ago, but it certainly made a difference in Michigan. Michigan is one of the 3 states that we believe put Trump in the White House 4 years ago. And Michigan, with its 16 electoral votes, actually the difference in the difference that Trump won by was only 10,000 votes. It was 0.3% of the vote total. So if we look over on the right at the table that I have, if you look at the, this is looking at the counties won by Biden, the percentage that Clinton got of those counties and the percentage that Biden got, and then same for Trump, 2016 and 2020. Biden actually did better than Clinton in all but 2 of these counties. And those, he did better, I'm sorry, Biden did better in all of these counties compared to Clinton. Only 0.6% difference in Cuyahoga, but you see a 4.4% difference in Franklin, about a 5-point difference in Hamilton, roughly the same, 1 point in Athens, about 1 point in Lucas, which is where Toledo is, Montgomery, where Dayton is, about a 3-point difference, Summit, about a 2-point difference. What's interesting is that Trump's performance actually declined in 2 of these counties, but went up in all the other 5. He slightly went down, less than a point in Franklin, about a point in Hamilton, but he went up by 2% in Cuyahoga. He went up by 3 points, about 3 points in Athens, 2 points in Lucas, 0.2 in Montgomery, not much there. And Montgomery had voted for Trump in 2016 and switched to voting for Biden, winning the county in 2020. And then Summit, just a 0.1 difference. But what this basically shows is that while Biden did better than Clinton in these urban counties that were critical to a Democratic win, he didn't do nearly as much as he needed to in order to overcome the huge advantage that Trump had going into 2020 compared to his 446,000 vote win in Ohio 4 years ago. So now let's look at how did we vote? Looking at the early voter turnout, we know that this had a critical impact on elections. And I'm going to use the 4-state comparison. This is the 4 states that we polled for the Great Lakes poll, the 4 polls that we conducted in 2020 through the Community Research Institute. We had partner faculty from Ohio Northern University and Oakland University in Michigan that helped with that. Students helped with writing questions, et cetera, and doing poll analysis. But just looking at the voter turnout, and this is data from the U.S. Elections Project, drawn from Secretary of State websites. This is the outfit out of University of Florida, Michael McDonald operates down, that was really helpful for all of us this season in tracking early voting turnout. So if we look at eligible voter turnout 2020, In Ohio, now these numbers are based on Secretary of State numbers, not based on actual eligibility by citizenship and age. So these numbers are going to be higher than the ones that I showed you earlier. 68.9% for Ohio, 70.5% for Michigan, 73.6% for Pennsylvania, 76.1%. These are really astounding changes. Ohio is actually a bit lower than it was 4 years ago, but we expect that to change because, again, keep in mind, this does not include those uncounted ballots. As a percentage of the 2020 vote, the early vote, now this is the mailed vote and in-person early voting combined, 52% in Ohio compared to the total vote, compared to the 2020 total vote, 38% Michigan, 51% Pennsylvania, 59% in Wisconsin. Which is really interesting given the troubles that Wisconsin and Pennsylvania had with the early vote going into the primaries in March and May. And also that Pennsylvania was really using the mass early vote for the first time. So it's really quite remarkable that we saw this kind of usage. Early vote is a percentage of the total 2016 vote. Now again, this is just the early vote for this year compared to the total vote for 2016. More than half for Ohio, 53.5, 42.4 in Michigan, 58.3 in Pennsylvania, 64.7% in Wisconsin. So despite all of the rhetoric and all of the attention to, was the Postal Service going to deliver your ballots on time? Did you get your ballot on time? Were ballots legitimate that were being mailed? All of those kinds of things that the presidential campaign of Trump focused on, that President Trump focused on, trying to cast doubt on the validity of the mailed ballot. And of course, all of this being driven by the issue of COVID-19 and how that was affecting people's choices about voting. Clearly, between the early vote that in some states only started a couple of weeks before the election, in other states they had longer periods, people were committed to voting. That's what these numbers tell us. And they took the safe route for many, which was to vote early. So now looking at what affected voter turnout. We had a variety of effects. Certainly COVID-19 was number one. It had a huge effect on voter mobilization efforts. Generally speaking, Republicans tended to rely more on rallies, as we saw. President Trump had many rallies. His typical approach, door-to-door canvassing, was practiced by Republicans. And of course, social media ads, cell phone texting, phone banking, and a lot of TV advertising as well. Democrats, however, avoided the door-to-door canvassing in general. There were some efforts, but it wasn't nearly as much as the Republicans were doing. They tended to look at the COVID-19 crisis and say, we need to just focus on reaching people virtually. And so social media ads, TV ads, a lot of cell phone texting, some phone banking were the Democrat strategy. The other factor was that the Trump ground game in general, partly because of the focus on door-to-door canvassing, was much stronger than the Biden campaign, particularly in states like Ohio. Some of that had to do with the fact that President Trump, like some of his predecessors, started campaigning for re-election about a month after getting inaugurated in 2017. He continued his rallies through the 4 years of his presidency. He had a very active campaign fundraising effort that continued through that same time period. And again, he's not the first to do that. We saw the same things by the Obama campaign, by the Bush campaign. Reagan was really the one that started a lot of that when he was running for re-election in '84. And as I mentioned, the polarization of the mailed ballot certainly had an effect, but it seemed to have the opposite effect of intended. Despite all the efforts to stoke fear of fraud, we saw more usage, not less, of the mailed ballot, and the same thing having to do with the use of the Postal Service. And then, of course, there was the foreign interference evidence, very clear that Russia, China, Iran were trying to actively interfere with our election through social media manipulation. There were some possibilities that there might have been hacking efforts into our election systems. But I think the big difference is that we knew this was coming. We were warned about it. The FBI and other intelligence agencies talked about it. And so I think people were a lot more aware of this. And so the net effect was more than likely much lower than it was 4 years ago. On to the money. What did it cost us to run presidential and congressional campaigns? Well, the numbers tell us a great story. In 2020, we busted the records by a long shot. $14 billion basically spent on congressional and presidential campaigns, 6.6 on the presidential, 7.3 on the congressional campaigns. This all comes from the Center for Responsive Politics Open Secrets site, compared to about $6.5 billion, so more than double 4 years ago. And what's interesting is that part of this is you had an open seat 4 years ago compared to an incumbent running against a challenger this year. Compared to 2012, that was a bit lower. It was 5.3 versus the 6.5 in 2016, and then just over $5 billion that was spent in 2008. Then when we look at the type of donations, so what kind of money was driving this huge amount of fundraising and spending? Self-funding actually went up to 13% in 2020 compared to almost 3% in 2016. That means the candidates themselves self-funding their campaigns, and that largely was on the side of President Trump, who does have a campaign debt that he's now trying to pay off, which is also part of what these solicitations about his legal funds that he's started to try to challenge the results in various states. The fine print on that says, after campaign debts are paid, any money left over will go to the legal fund. So Rudy Giuliani needs to wait to get paid. Organizations, and this would be interest groups that are not PACs, political organizations, et cetera, about 3% in 2020, a little lower than the 4.39% spent in, that was 2016. PACs were lower. A lot of the negative attention on PAC spending from 2008 and onward, their money didn't necessarily, they spent, they just didn't spend directly on campaigns, about 5% versus 9 4 years ago. Large individual donations. So this is the one that everybody's interested in. This includes your dark money, unlimited individual spending. It was 48.62% in 2016, actually lower as a percentage this year, 41.53, and that's because we see an increase in small donations, 22% this year compared to about 16% 4 years ago. So the good news in this, despite the fact that billions were spent, is that small individual donations made a much more significant impact on spending on donations in this year's cycle compared to 4 years ago. And then the other category, which is varieties of organizations that don't fit these particular designations, basically are about 15% of what was given in 2020 compared to almost 20% in 2016. So now the question, how did we spend the money? Independent expenditures is the arena where we're talking about money not spent directly by a campaign or a candidate. This is money that's spent separately on behalf of a candidate. So they can't coordinate with the campaign. They do it separately, but they are clearly backing one or the other candidates or parties or platforms. So in the 2020 cycle, this would be political action committees, political parties themselves, which funded a lot of the advertising, and then what we call the dark money groups. These are the 501c4 groups who do not have to report who their donors are, do not have to report their spending, because they are called political education organizations. And by that, they have First Amendment protections that don't apply to other 501c organizations that have to report according to the rules of the Federal Election Commission. This group of expenditures, Republicans this year, 3.8 billion of their spending came from these kinds of groups. Democrats, 6.9 billion. And for those of you wondering how much a billionaire can do, there's your number, and it was on the Democratic side. 1.4 billion between Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg was spent on this campaign. Now that includes the money they spent on their own campaigns for president, but Bloomberg said he would spend $1 billion, and he looks like he came pretty close, because after he dropped out, he then rededicated that money. Some of it went to the Democratic Party, most of it went to his own independent organizations that did a lot with things like voter mobilization in Florida. Then when we look at independent expenditures for the year, now this is just for the period, the year itself. For 2020, we are at 2.6 billion, 1.3 billion, so it was more than double 2016, the 1.3 billion. Then if we look at how much was spent just from after the conventions, political conventions, from about August 23rd through October 25th, and that after is a bit fuzzy because the Democrats actually were running their convention right about the time of that date. And again, this is all from Open Secrets. 1.96 billion, or 76% of that money, was spent just in that time period in 2020 versus 52% of the money raised in 2016, 691 million. And then when we look at states that got the attention, these are the states. We are one of them. We certainly weren't at the top like we were 4 years ago. Pennsylvania was 47. And so you have campaign visits by Biden and Trump. And then on the right, you have just the spending on TV advertising. The big kahuna was Florida, not surprising, at 258 million, followed by Pennsylvania at 196, North Carolina at 111, Michigan at 120, Wisconsin at 102, Ohio only 19 million actually spent on ads, because partly because the spending happened mostly towards the end of the campaigns, and it was the Democrats that were doing the spending. The Trump spending actually got cut back because Trump thought he would win Ohio without needing that spending based on their internal polling, and he was absolutely right. And so that money got redirected to other states. The competitive states were these states. These are the ones that were seen as the swings. Notice, however, that states like Texas, Georgia, Iowa, which were also talked about, Arizona's on the list, but those other three states that were talked about as swing states did not get this kind of attention, either in visits or in advertising. So this last slide, and then we can go to discussion, is so what's next for the Democrat and Republican parties? And the Greens and Libertarians, we can't forget them. Certainly minor parties this year had a much lower vote total, about 3% between the two parties. Some of that was the nature of their candidates. They didn't have that much money. The Green candidate was not able to get on the ballot in many states, and so had to go as a write-in. But generally speaking, people were choosing their sides between the two major parties. Of course, the Georgia runoff election is critical in 2021, January 5th. David Perdue, the incumbent, running for re-election against John Ossoff. Kelly Loeffler, the Republican incumbent, who's in the special election to fill the term against Reverend Raphael Warnock. And a huge part of this has been the Fair Fight organization that Stacey Abrams, the gubernatorial candidate from 18, put together to mobilize voters. And it has had a huge impact on Georgia moving from a reliably red state to now looking like, after we're done with the recount, Georgia is in the Democratic column for president, having voted for Joe Biden by about 14,000 votes out of about 5.6 million votes cast. I would say going forward, in the short term, given the House Democratic majority having slimmed by at least 6 to 8 seats, the Senate could be Republican majority or tied if Democrats win both of those Georgia seats. And of course, then Kamala Harris will be the tiebreaker as the vice president. And Biden himself is a pragmatic moderate. So the fears of conservatives and Trump supporters that we're going to wind up with socialism the moment Biden becomes president are unfounded. Even the fears that we're going to see dramatic tax increases, I think, are largely unfounded. My bet is that the Republicans will get at least one of those seats, if not both, in Georgia. So it'll be a close Senate, and you have some of the people like Susan Collins, the Republican in Maine who won re-election, who will be someone that the Democrats will turn to try to get on their side on some of these issues, and who has been pretty independent in her voting. Lisa Murkowski, the Republican from Alaska, is another one, and of course Mitt Romney, the Republican from Utah. Those three have at times broken from the Republican group to vote with the Democrats on different issues. Within the parties, looking longer term, for Democrats, there will be continued tensions between the progressive wing, moderates, and the voting demographics. Now, if you remember what we talked about at the beginning, we saw sizable percentages of particularly the Latino vote, which is the fastest growing demographic group in the country. It's also the group that is tipping the scales in big states like Texas, states like Arizona, Nevada, even some of the southern states like North Carolina and of course Florida. But they do not vote as a bloc. and it is a big political mistake to think that way. Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans, people from Central America, heritage from South America, all of these, Venezuela, all of these have very different perspectives on their politics, on their level of conservatism or liberalism. And so parties have to be really smart and very precise in how they approach those different parts of what is largely referred to as the, quote, Latino bloc. The same thing goes for the suburbs. Suburbs have been swinging back and forth, and we saw that change particularly among women voting in 18 and of course voting again this year. For Republicans, is Trumpism a movement, a moment, or a movement? There's some that suggest that once he leaves the stage, a lot of what he was will go with him. There are others that would suggest that the 76 million people who voted for Trump aren't going away anytime soon and aren't going to forget him or what he stood for. I think time will tell, but this will certainly have an influence, I think, on the Republican Party long term. They have in many ways a new constituency that they now have to figure out what to do with Trump off the stage. White blue-collar workers who are still a sizable part of the electorate. What do they do to secure and expand the chunk of the Latino vote that they got? Black males who increased in their vote for Trump compared to 4 years ago. These are all opportunities for Republicans to pursue. It'll be interesting to see how that all unfolds. And then, do third parties have an influence? They had an influence 4 years ago in 2000. Not this year so much, but there's always that possibility with these close divides state by state that third party candidates could make a difference in the outcome, certainly of presidential campaigns. And then the larger forces of populism, nationalism, identity politics, and racial justice are not going away anytime soon. The challenges are that how these connect to issues like immigration are difficult to see at times and get a handle on. Some are very divisive. Things like racial justice are hugely important given what we saw this summer with the protests and demonstrations, but those were specifically in part about the issue of policing and police use of force against Black males. We have over 9,000 units of law enforcement across this country. And so trying to figure out how to change policy at the local level across the country is an enormous challenge. But I think it will continue to be with us for as long as we see these kinds of incidents take place and the public reaction. And then finally, the issues. COVID-19, how it will be managed by the Biden administration, the timing of the possible vaccine and its usage, where will we be 6 months, a year, even 2 years from now because of that. The economy is always a big issue. We are recovering from the COVID effects, but that recovery is uneven. Some people are getting advantages out of what has happened. Others have been even more disadvantaged. Healthcare continues to be a huge issue. Joe Biden would like to expand the Affordable Care Act's access and create a public option. He's looking at maybe increasing the number that are uninsured to become insured by about from about 92% up to about 97%. That's his goal. Climate change, energy policy, transportation policy will have certainly be at the forefront in the Biden administration. He's made that very clear. Trying to incentivize the private sector to go to things like electric cars, non-fossil fuel usage, et cetera. And then finally, trade and tax policy. Looming over all of this, we heard a lot of promises made by both campaigns, and not one of them for a moment talked about this little thing called the debt that is now sitting at $27 trillion. Our US debt has now, for the first time in modern history, exceeded our GDP. And that pattern is likely not going to change anytime in the next several years. So at some point, private markets, investors, et cetera, are going to wake up to that reality. And despite low interest rates, are going to start to see that access to credit, access to capital may start to get restricted because of the huge amount of that that gets swallowed by federal deficit spending. And that may put a real constraint on whoever is in the White House this next 4 years from now and ongoing. Remember the grand old days of the 80s and 90s when we heard about 5-year deficit reduction plans, and budget balancing in that 3-year hiatus from 98 to 2001 when we actually had a balanced budget. Those days are gone, and I don't think they're coming back anytime soon. And I do think that they're going to have a big impact on a lot of these issues as well. So with that, time for questions.
Okay, I guess we'll start with questions. We have a lot of questions, I have to say. And let's see, I don't know my things to. So let's get started with the question, who actually won this election? In the Cleveland Debate Forum, President-elect was asked the following question. Vice President Biden, will you pledge not to declare victory until the election is independently certified? And he said yes. Has this election been independently certified? What does that even mean?
Well, independent certified, I'm sorry, independent.
So did Vice President Biden actually win?
In reality, yes. Technically, no. But the technicality is the same technicality that has applied to every other president who has been declared a winner by the AP and other media outfits based on vote returns and based on the margin that can't be accounted for by ballots that are still being counted. Now, it was different this year because we had such a large use of the early vote and the mail ballot that's still being counted. Vote certification in every state basically is the final number. It typically comes out about 3 weeks after the election. In presidential elections, it's always done before the final decision about who the Electoral College delegation for that state will be, so that is the number that they're using, not estimates, not waiting for ballots, etc. But practically speaking, yes, Vice President Biden misspoke in the term certified that he used. I wouldn't necessarily hold it against him in the larger scheme of things, because he is acting like a president-elect in the same way that that Trump did, and Obama, and Bush, and basically every president going back to the days when we first got calls. And there have been a lot of recalls of the Dewey beats Truman headline that Truman is holding up the day after the election. He was, however, he waited for several days before the final call happened on Pennsylvania last Saturday. And that was when that call came in and he got to the 270, he got past it, that we saw him starting to act like he was the president-elect with the rally that happened that night and what's been happening since.
So even though Biden theoretically won the election, Trump's numbers are very high and his people are very loud. Will the Republican Party remain, and the Republican Party probably will remain under the control of, if not Donald Trump, at least Trump's way of thinking? How will Biden be able to govern in this type of atmosphere?
Well, I think one of the first things is that he pledged that he would be a president for all the people, and how he governs is going to tell us a lot about what that really means. I think what I described earlier about the political realities of control of the Congress are going to force Biden, whether he likes it or not, to work in small incremental steps when it comes to policy implementation. We will see a raft of executive orders that he can issue, some of them having to do with immigration in particular, lifting some of the restrictions that were imposed by Trump by executive order. I think things like the stability of our civil service that has been threatened in some ways by recent politicization of a lot of the appointments that have happened and firings that we've seen by Trump. But beyond that, the fears of a Green New Deal, trillions of spending on things like climate change efforts, et cetera, those things aren't going to happen. And we often are frustrated by the short-term memory and vision of Americans, particularly when it comes to our politics. But in this case, that may actually be a plus. Because I would suggest that in 6 months to a year, a lot of the angst, a lot of the division is at the very least, the temperature I think is going to drop on that. It'll still be there. The root issues of polarization aren't going away. What I would like to see, but certainly can't predict, would be to see a President-elect Biden really look deeply along and urge the party to look deeply at who are these constituencies that are not voting for Democrats who used to vote for Democrats, and ask the question why. What meaningful policies can be implemented and get Congress to agree to in bipartisan votes that really would offer real concrete support to blue collar workers, to farmers, to agriculture, to people living in cities where poverty rates are so persistent that nobody votes, because why would you? It's not going to make a difference. This is why we saw, precincts across Cuyahoga County in middle-class suburbs and in the west side of Cleveland. Those precincts were voting at 70, 75, 80, 85%. But if you look at the poorest neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland and then some of those immediate surrounding suburbs, it was in the 50s and the 40s. And those are patterns that have been around for a long time. And I don't blame a single person for not voting under those circumstances, because they haven't seen anybody help them in any way, whether it's Mayor Jackson or anybody else.
Right.
So.
I live in a middle-class eastern suburb. I'm in South Euclid, and one of my neighbors who came from Ghana but can vote, didn't vote because he thinks it's not worth voting. He sees no purpose in voting. Years ago, I lived in Camden, New Jersey. I lived in Philly rather, and I worked in reproductive health, STD, public health issues in Camden, New Jersey, which was Black, Puerto Rican. Then I moved to rural Wisconsin and West Central Wisconsin. And what I noticed, which is all white, which I noticed the issues there are the same, whether it was teenage pregnancy, drug use, lack of jobs, food deserts, you have to drive, all the issues were actually very much the same. And yet these two groups of people really hate each other and don't see commonality. It seems to me somehow there'd be a way of reaching the commonality needs of both these groups of people, which would be a huge voting bloc if any of them actually voted.
Well, and I think the one thing that can be done, and unfortunately the political rhetoric really kind of made it controversial 10 years ago, but a lot of people now appreciate what it did, is the expansion of healthcare access under the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
One of the most severely hit areas in the country by hospital closures and lack of access are rural areas. Mm-hmm. And we're particularly seeing that highlighted by the COVID-19 crisis. So
right now, the town I lived in, Wisconsin, has no hospital beds left. They have to send people over 100 miles away to find a hospital bed. And
that's that kind of thing. And again, it's getting at those, the underlying disparities have been brought to the surface, and all of us now see it. And if we don't see some kind of fundamental change in delivery, in access, et cetera, we may get past the COVID-19 crisis, but there's going to be another one down the pike. And in the meantime, all of these other kinds of issues with chronic diseases, the opioid crisis, a whole host of issues continue to be with us. Meaningful outreach in policies that make a difference, whichever party does them. And I'm sure nobody's going to argue whether it's a Republican or a Democrat that delivers you a new hospital or a new healthcare facility. That to me is the kind of thing that don't try to manage the economy. Don't try to get people when it comes to tax policy, and stop playing this class warfare, which both sides do. I got very frustrated by the confirmation hearings for Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett, and the way the Democrats just demonized her on the basis of the vote on the Affordable Care Act. Anybody following that issue knew that the Supreme Court was not going to wholesale eliminate that act. And based on the arguments last week, they made it clear, no, we will get rid of the individual mandate that means nothing anyway, because there's no money for it.
So Trump has this policy of blame, rage, as part of the Republican platform, which appeals to a lot of people, just blaming someone else for the problem. And it appealed to a lot of women, Latinos. So that basically it looks to me like the GOP rejected like the PC culture and language of socialism, some of the Latinx language, that type of thing. What can we do to change the language? Because the needs are the needs are the same, but the language seems to be getting in the way. That makes sense.
It's a good question, because the language itself does become divisive. One of them, the demonstrations this summer were profoundly important, the most street activism we've seen since the 1960s.
Right.
And I think have had the beginnings of meaningful effect in terms of awareness. But even then, some of the language around that is not necessarily very helpful to get people to open up to, yes, this is an issue and we need to do something about it. I coordinate our Africana Studies minor. I deal with these issues all the time. And so we talk about things like white privilege and systemic racism, et cetera. To see those terms being talked about by Fortune 500 companies was astounding.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to be careful on a personal level to get people to see the problems that need to be solved and not get into the blame game. And unfortunately, the blame game is a lot of what has supplanted problem solving.
Right.
One of the worst phrases that came out of this was defund the police.
Yeah, right.
It completely politicized what was otherwise something, because no, what you need to do to address these issues of use of force and cultural change is more funding for the police.
Right.
And maybe then look meaningfully, like Cleveland has just started sending social work, a pilot program to send social workers and mental health workers with police to respond to calls that have to do with mental health crises, those kinds of things. Now, it should have been doing that decades ago, but
well, it was done decades ago. 30 years ago, my husband worked in Delaware County
all right.
as a crisis worker with the police. He was the 24-hour crisis hotline. Police had a mental health issue. He went out with the police.
And that's
down off the high wires or get the person to put their clothes back on, whatever it was.
Right, right.
So it's an old model. It's just people didn't want to pay taxes and pay for it. Right.
Right. And that's also the critical thing. Education, healthcare, and safety are the three things that concern people most. If we get to real solutions, be ready to pay more, because you don't get this stuff cheap. And that is one of the bottom lines. And we keep throwing it on the local communities. Raise your taxes. We won't do it at the federal or the state level.
Right.
And we see the result.
Right, exactly. So this is changing topic a little bit. The Baldwin Wallace Great Lakes poll indicated popular support for eliminating the Electoral College. Colorado had a Proposition 113 asking if voters wanted to end the Electoral College. What would it take to disband the Electoral College? Could it be done by 2024? And what would be the advantage or disadvantage of getting rid of the Electoral College?
Well, first of all, to formally eliminate it requires a constitutional amendment. And that is a Herculean task, no matter what it is that you're trying to accomplish. There is the Popular Vote Initiative. It has a different title that I don't remember, but it basically is states adopting a rule that would say that we will send a delegation that matches the national popular vote, even if it's different from what our state's vote was. Now, the states that have voted for that are the states that have typically, where the national vote has matched their own politics, meaning Democratic controlled states, so West Coast states, et cetera. And therein lies the problem, because states that see the Electoral College as an advantage in terms of winning the presidency because of a collection of small states being able to compete versus a few large states that have larger populations, that's the real challenge in terms of the plus and minus of the Electoral College. The national vote makes a lot more sense, just logically. The problem is, how do you then show that through a national vote, you'll still have a chance as a state that's largely rural at having an impact on the national vote total, or will it simply be completely controlled by large population centers? The changes in states like Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona are an example of that. They became rapidly growing states. It was their urban centers that grew, and lo and behold, their politics moved from a Republican to Democrat. Now, that's not a guarantee, but that's certainly been the trend line. Texas in the same boat. Texas said we want to do low taxes, business friendly, attract people. They got exactly what they wanted. And then they became competitive as a state for Democrats to run it. So be careful what you ask for politically. So I think I am doubtful that a movement to eliminate the Electoral College will have any impact. I'd rather see a package of federal efforts to try to for instance, create a uniform system of voting in presidential elections and maybe congressional as well, where we don't have all this variation in voter access, ballot access, mail
I
ballot.
mean, rather than state control, which we have right now.
Well, here's the way that we do it, which is how we do most things. We certainly wouldn't mandate it, but money makes the world go round. And so just like with our road systems, they're largely funded in part by federal dollars that then tell us things like what our speed limit should be and whether kids should drink at 18 or 21 and a whole host of other things. Education is another area. Do the same thing with voting. You throw some money at states saying, we're going to help you reform your voting systems. We'll provide the money for some of the technology changes, et cetera. But in exchange, you have to abide by these standards that we're going to set nationally. That's the way you, and I guarantee it wouldn't take that much if you could take the burden of some of that funding off states' hands, and then they'll go with the rules. Makes
sense. So again, it comes back to money. How do we make paying taxes an acceptable thing to do to have a stable, environment that we live in? Infrastructure.
Well, we do have this curious paradox that whatever we're told to pay for a product that we purchase, we usually don't question it, even on a car lot. But when we want to pay, what we're told to pay more taxes for the services that we get, a lot of us scream and say we pay too much, et cetera. It goes back to, you're always going to have an element of that you just have to live with, but there's another part of it that is people need to have a sense that their dollars are being used in a way that they see a benefit. I think it's that simple, and we don't see much of that these days.
So in Ohio, this is changing again. In Ohio, did early voting appear to favor either party? With record turnout, relatively smooth election day in the middle of a health pandemic and overall Republican strength, it appears that they should be eager to make early voting easier.
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at the early vote turnout and the overall vote turnout in the counties that voted for Trump versus voted for Biden, they should be embracing early voting, and I think we may see that. Ohio has a longer history of early voting, going back to 2006. So we've it's been incorporated into our political culture. I don't think we saw the kind of outcry in our state that you saw in Pennsylvania and a few other states for whom it was newer. So it's sort of been depoliticized, and yes, absolutely. In Ohio, it was about voter mobilization. This state still can elect statewide Democrats, but you've got to have a much better mobilization ground game in areas where you might have Democrats. And quite frankly, you need to have candidates who appeal to a broader swath of the constituency, which goes back to the issue of the rural. So if you just write off the rural areas of Ohio and say, those are Republicans, we're never going to be able to get them to vote Democrat, well, then don't plan on winning any statewide elections anytime soon. Shared ground is the exception, not the hope for the future. He's great, and it's great that he's been able to win, but I think a lot of that's who he is and his longevity, and the fact that he's also gotten lucky. He's run against some really weak candidates, right. So don't forget that part.
So this is maybe related, not a little different, but related to each other. What factors have transformed Ohio from a swing state into a full-fledged red state? And then why have third parties never done well in either local elections or state elections? Why we go Democrat or Republican?
Great questions. Well, first of all, Ohio generally has flatlined in our demographics. We haven't had much population change. And so if we just are static, essentially what's happening is, in 3 words, we're getting older, whiter, and more conservative. And so as a result, we see more voting for Republican candidates. That's one major factor. And compared to other states that we see as swing states, those are states where they're either larger and they have 2 major population centers. We have 3, but they're shrinking. Philadelphia is the 4th largest city in the country. So even though Pennsylvania has a lot of demographics similar to us, and Pittsburgh would be similar to a Cincinnati or a Cleveland, they're just still a larger state, and a lot of it is because of that eastern part of the state. So they have that advantage. But again, the Midwest in general and even the Northeast are seeing those same kinds of things happening, with a few exceptions like New York, where you have the city. Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, the common denominator is that metro areas are growing rapidly and attracting people. Florida will always be that way just because of the nature of the state, until they finally sink underwater and everybody comes back here where you can actually have water and dry land at the same time. So I think those are the factors that have changed us from swing to red. And then the other question had to do with, I'm sorry.
With third parties. I mean, you know, if people aren't happy with either party, is there any alternatives, and why can't the alternatives gain traction?
The primary factor is the huge amount of funding and organization needed for a third party to gain traction nationally. And you actually have to start at the local level, which is where a lot of your expenses, if you're trying to run candidates in local races, statewide races. You need someone who's willing to commit the rest of their life and resources to that, like a Tom Steyer or a Michael Bloomberg. But the other problem you have is that if you start to gain traction, one or the other of the parties is going to try to pull those voters away from that party and into their own. The other is, to win elections, you have to be able to build coalitions of people who don't necessarily agree with each other on all issues. And by definitions, the Libertarians, the Greens, those are the two most prominent, tend to be much narrower in their focus on what they see as a platform. If they start expanding it to get voters, they're going to sacrifice their ideological purity. So that's really the challenge, I think. And it looks like, at least based on this election, people were happy to just vote for one of the two major parties, because it's no longer what Bill Bradley in New Jersey called 20 years ago, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. You cannot make the argument that these parties are not different. That no longer holds. Very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Right. Are there any Ohio Democrats with enough support and visibility to mount a credible challenge to DeWine or Portman in 2022?
The short answer would be no, but I'll follow it by maybe. Tim Ryan has gotten some national attention through his presidential run, and I think could be a viable candidate to run for governor. He's played the Hamlet card a couple of times in previous efforts to get him to run for governor. Maybe this time will be different, particularly because in 2022, one of our congressional districts is most likely going to disappear. Now, my bet is that because we have the new system for allocating districts, we have a minority vote veto potential that could make them a little bit less gerrymandered. The Snake on the Lake 9th district that I live in is most likely going to disappear.
So that's the one you think is going to disappear?
Yeah, that's my money. But I think Tim Ryan's district will get changed in ways that will make it more competitive, and that might nudge him to think about maybe running statewide. Who
decides that boundary?
This is going to be decided by, I believe it's a commission that will report to the legislature, and then there will be a vote in the legislature where there has to be, and then the commission, I believe, the map has to be approved by a certain number of the minority party votes in order.
So it's a bipartisan commission?
Yeah. So I would put my money on maybe Tim Ryan, maybe Joyce Beatty. I think she'd be another possibility. I don't think Marcy Kaptur. I think she'll just retire if her district is eliminated. Yeah, those are really the only ones. Unless Sherrod Brown changes his mind and decides he wants to be governor. Which maybe he would certainly be the strongest one right off the bat, because he's won statewide a few times.
Would you please focus a little on Cuyahoga County voting levels, both good and not so good?
So Cuyahoga County, it looks like if you look at the total number of people who cast a ballot, that we did better than 2016. We're still getting the count, and we're one of the counties where that is significant. We may have increased to about 68 or 69% compared to 66% 4 years ago. Breaking down the county, we saw very strong turnout in areas that voted for President Trump, like Parma, Parma Heights, Independence, some of those other suburbs. Interestingly, what have been reliably Republican and wealthier suburbs actually voted for Biden They switched. Rocky River, Bay Village, Westlake. Ward 17 in Cleveland had the highest turnout at about 78% for a ward in Cleveland. But then the wards in the east side, as I mentioned before, and some of the south side ones were much lower. They were 58, 54, some even below 50% turnout. And that's of registered voters. So overall, Cuyahoga, I think, has the potential to turn out a lot more voters, but there needs to be an effective ground game. And honestly, from what I see, I see efforts being made by the county party, but it needs to be better. I think they need to go to some workshops run by Fight for the Vote that Stacey Abrams is running. And they also need to show at the county level that services that are being provided by Democratic office holders are making a difference to the larger population and not just to constituents that typically need these services, like child protection services and unfortunately prison population, those kinds of things, which that doesn't get, the larger public doesn't see that.
How would the larger public even learn about what's done?
That's a great question. We actually, the CRI ran a survey for Cuyahoga County 2 years ago, a phone survey of 1,100 respondents. And we had to structure it to essentially first explain what the county does, because most people don't know. I informally asked the question of my colleagues at DW, and not a single one of 7 people I talked to could name one service that's actually the county. They knew a lot of services. So they'd say things like, oh, the parks. Well, no, that's the metro parks, they're separate. The libraries, no, that's separate. Public transportation, no, that's the RTA. So because we've divided up all of these services that people use on a mass basis into separate commissions and separate boards. So the county could perhaps go on more of a public relations effort to explain what they do. But even there, delineating, well, hey, some of these roads that run through your town actually have county dollars that are helping to pay for it.
Right.
That would help, because that's the kind of thing that people use. Even things that aren't necessarily the county, but a broader definition of what the county is, because they do have a lot to do with public transportation, might also help them as well.
Right. I mean, personally, one suggestion might be having a newsletter and tell people what they do. Have it on their website. You know, when you go to vote, it's hard to find out what people do and what they think.
Right.
Find a platform statement, it's almost impossible, you know?
Well, and this is also, it's a sensitive area. We do a lot of work with public agencies and nonprofits, and most of it's about public perception. Maybe they have a levy coming up. We've done them for the few libraries, the county library. We've done them for the sewer district several times. But the moment you start spending money on those kinds of things like surveys and public relations efforts, taxpayers start to get a little irritated, saying, why is my money being spent on that?
Well, but you know, in terms of like my city council, only one person answers questions if you email them a question.
You know? Exactly. So there's responsiveness, yeah.
Right. Yeah, you gotta like let people know. People who want to know should be able to find out.
Well, and this COVID, I just add real quick, one thing that I'm seeing is that with the access through Zoom of public meetings, most of which are now on this platform,
Right.
I don't have to go anywhere. I can just tune into the local city council meeting and watch and even ask questions. So I think they ought to capitalize on that too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't have come out today with the rain, you know?
Right.
It's terrible weather. So what was any analysis done on messaging, given the loss of the Democrats in the House? What do you attribute that to?
I think there was too much of a nationalization of the campaign as a vote for me as a vote against Trump, and not enough attention on the issues that people care about. Because President Trump is such a polarizing figure, I think there was too much attention paid to that and not enough attention paid to the issues. Now, on several issues, President Trump is a very conventional Republican. Cut taxes, cut regulation, appoint conservative justices. No different from George W. Bush or Reagan or anybody else since Reagan. But people, there are a lot of people who don't want to hear this, but there are many people who vote only on the basis of an issue that they are concerned about or an issue that directly affects them. And the lowest common denominator, the widest common denominator is the economy. And so a lot of people voted for Trump and for congressional candidates who said they supported him simply because they saw the economy roaring along until COVID. COVID hit, they didn't blame the president for COVID. They didn't blame him for the economy necessarily sinking. And then the economy started coming back. And so in their personal lives, they said, okay, my wages went up, my job got better, my family had more. I'm voting for the guy that made that happen. And even if he didn't,
My 401k is great. My 401k
is great. Yeah, which is the other, like, I don't know what's going on on Wall Street, but so, and I think the other is that some of the messaging by Democrats, again, real issues for certain constituencies, but other constituencies either say it doesn't affect me or you're making me the one that's turning those people into victims, the race issues, those kinds of things. And I think, again, politically, that's tough to, it's hard to figure out how to make that balance and make that message effective.
Right. Compared with race and ethnicity, how important will economic class be as a future influence on parties and elections, especially given the widening income gap that's continued to expand?
It's a great question. And I think it may be also the opportunity that either party could have. And I think this is where Republicans had an advantage in the way that they handled this issue. It is about if things like economic disparity get framed more on the basis of who has and who hasn't, as opposed to on the issues of Black disparity or Latino disparity or whatever, I think you'll see more broad acceptance of policies that might help in that way. So she's reading the questions. All right. So at any rate, sorry about that. I
no problem. Yeah.
So the bottom line is economic disparity doesn't sway voters. Their own personal perception about their opportunity to rise is what sways them. Running against the wealthy, running against the rich that don't pay taxes. There are some people who that resonates with, but for most people, whether you're a billionaire and I'm not is not the issue. It's, can I move ahead in my life and can I make a better life for my children? And whether that better life means that they're going to technical school to become a plumber, or that they're getting a scholarship to go to a local state university, whatever it happens to be, that's what they're focused on, because that's their real lives. And I think the more that you focus on the issues that affect people at that level, economically, and certainly politically, you're going to get more support. This is why Nancy Pelosi kept saying in 2018, make sure that you're running on the issue of healthcare, because that's the #1 issue that people keep talking about. And it worked. This year, it was one of the many things that got talked about in platforms by Biden and Democratic candidates, but it lost its focus and, quite frankly, kind of missed an opportunity, given COVID-19 is something that everybody's concerned about, and it's a healthcare issue.
Can you discuss the African-American turnout in Cuyahoga County and why it turned out the way it did?
Again, I go to this issue of the high poverty rates that we have in many of the areas where we have concentrations of African Americans in the east side of Cleveland and in the suburbs like Garfield Heights, Maple Heights, Euclid, East Cleveland. Now, in some of those suburbs, you've got more of a mix. You've got middle class, you've got some that are fairly wealthy. You have that in the outer suburbs like Solon, Twinsburg, places like that, Orange. But I think that in terms of the numbers, where we saw that lower turnout that made a difference in the ability of a Democrat to win statewide, it was in those, I think it correlates, at least initially, with socioeconomic status. And it goes back to that question of, I'm surrounded by Democratic office holders and I don't see anything changing in my life. My city councilman's mayor, the mayor's a Democrat, the party's Democratic dominated, my ward club hasn't met for the last 2 years. I don't even know what a ward club is. And if I go to a meeting, there's 5 people there and the median age is 70, no offense, but that tends to be the makeup. Why should I be involved? So I think another part of it is who people see as their leaders is going to make a difference. There's been calls for a new generation of leadership that's needed in Cleveland specifically. They got a mayor's election this coming year. Will that happen, or will people see what appear to be the same faces or a version of the same faces running again and making the same promises and nothing happening? It's no longer about paving streets. It's still about police and police safety. It's about economic opportunity in real terms. The only area of economic growth that we have at the levels of unskilled people who are coming out of with a high school degree or a high school dropout, or the building of Amazon warehouses, and other areas of retail like working at Target or working in fast food, et cetera. That really hasn't changed much since where we were 20, 30 years ago. Okay.
To have lost Debbie.
Oh, she's
Yeah, oh,
back.
you're back, great.
Hi there, sorry, I got kicked off once again. It happens every time, I'll tell you. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I have to wait just a second. Is there a question that you have, Wayne? Wayne, could you ask a question? Because I right now lost my question.
Oh, sure, sure. We've got a lot of questions left in the group. We could go on for another hour. Unfortunately, our time is just about up. Maybe here's one question I always have.
Okay.
Is it seems like misinformation is still a key part of our election process. Do you see any answer to that?
You know, and on top of that, like the influence of Fox News versus MSNBC.
The only change to that's going to happen is individual choices about what they consume and how much they fact check. So long as we have a First Amendment, we're going to continue to have misinformation from media, from social media, from efforts to do everything from spread rumors about massive voter fraud to due to COVID, we've canceled the election on this day. Please come on Thursday after election day to vote. These are old tricks. I don't see any regulation taking place, and certainly the discussion about trying to regulate social media in ways that are going to make them more responsible. They're self-regulating, and I think they did a much better job this year than they did 4 years ago. But again, it goes back to individual responsibility. We have to take responsibility for what we consume, for what we watch, for what we don't watch or read or listen to. And we have to look for, ideally, a diversity of opinions. But that requires a lot of time. I'm in the business of doing this, and I don't have enough time to do as much as I'd like to, looking at conservative and liberal and progressive and moderate perspectives. I will say as a general rule, the cable stations, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, the big three, the news provision is a part of what they do, but the bigger part of how they fill that 24/7 cycle is punditry. And it's to a particular audience that they see as the ones that will watch them and listen to them and then sit around for the ads. So they're, just by definition, the business model is appeal to people who are part of your tribe, liberal, conservative, et cetera. The only way to get away from that is to hit the off button. And so just personally, I don't watch news on TV or cable or anything else. I read sites. I do follow Twitter, but I follow mostly journalists, elected officials, and academics. I find my life is a lot more pleasant as a result. I don't get riled up by extremes on either side. And it is professionally important for me to look at all perspectives and to try to get the longer view and disaggregate from the moment of the fever dream of the moment, wherever it's coming from. So that would be my response to the issue of, yeah, I'd love to wave a magic wand and make it go away, but it's part of our landscape. And quite frankly, if we had a market that started moving towards, I want fact-based news and only fact-based news, and I'm tired of pundits, and we start to see that in people's viewer and listening habits, I guarantee you the programming of those stations, those news outlets would begin to change. Because it's all about audience. They're businesses.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you don't listen to them because I must admit, I feel like I need to listen to all of them a little bit just to get the wider viewpoint. But thank you so much. You've answered questions really nicely, and I'm sorry I got lost there for.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
Let's turn it back over to Ken. Are you in charge here?
And Ken is going to take over.
Well, quickly, Dr. Sutton, thank you for your comments, and particularly voter turnout. That was very informative. And I thank all our attendees for joining us. But next Sunday on November 22nd, our next topic will deal with racism, healthcare inequities, and the future. COVID-19, of course, is a major issue, and other health issues that have disproportionately affected African Americans in severity and numbers. So what progressive healthcare actions might we see in the near future, locally and to the future? Our speaker will be Dr. Gregory Hall. He is a physician and the president of the Cuyahoga County Board of Health and a former chair of the Ohio Commission of Minority Health. This forum has been recorded. So for those who would like to go back and review the recording, go to our website, uucleveland.org, and click on the taskbar community and then drop down to forums and you will have a recording. Now today's forum may be available tomorrow, but past forums are available. Also, we invite you to join our service, UUCC service, which will be at 11 o'clock. Again, go to our website, uucleveland.org, and you'll see a large green square on the screen. Click on that square, and you will be able to be part of a Zoom event, and you will be able to participate. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Sutton.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for all your wonderful questions. We couldn't do it without you.
Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.